Welcome back to Religious Stories to Sleep To. Take a moment to pause and settle yourself into a place of comfort. Let the weight of the day fade away as you prepare to unwind. Close your eyes if it feels right and allow yourself to focus on your breathing. Take a deep breath in through your nose. Hold it for a moment. And then gently exhale through your mouth. Let the tension leave your body. Let's try that again. Inhale peace. Hold it softly. And exhale any worries or cares you may be holding. As you relax, imagine yourself in a safe and serene space. It could be a sunlit meadow, a quiet forest, or even a cozy room illuminated by the soft glow of a warm fire. Wherever your mind takes you, let that place bring you peace and stillness. Tonight, this is your time to rest, reflect, and reconnect. In this tranquil moment, we will journey into the timeless wisdom of the Bible. Each story we share carries a message of hope, redemption, and faith, gently guiding us closer to the comfort of God's presence. Tonight's story is one of the most cherished parables, the story of the Prodigal Son. It is a tale of forgiveness, love, and the infinite grace of our Heavenly Father. As we begin, take another deep breath. Inhale the calmness of this moment. And exhale anything weighing on your heart. Feel the soothing rhythm of your breath aligning with the peaceful words of this story. With each sentence, let yourself drift further into a state of relaxation. Thank you for allowing us to share this moment with you. Let the warmth of God's love and the lessons of His Word guide you into rest and reflection. This is your time to be still and know His presence. Now let us begin. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. The parable of the prodigal son, one of the most beloved stories in the Bible, has touched hearts for generations. It speaks of redemption, forgiveness, and the boundless love of a father. To truly understand the depth of this story, let's first step back in time to the fields, homes, and traditions of ancient Israel, where inheritance and family bonds held profound significance. Picture a quiet village nestled among rolling hills. The warm glow of the morning sun illuminates the fertile lands where families toil together generation after generation, building a legacy that ties them to the land and to one another. In such a culture, a family's wealth was not simply monetary, but steeped in tradition. Land, livestock, and reputation were passed down as sacred trusts. Here, the story of the prodigal son begins. A father, likely an elder of his community, oversees his household with wisdom and care. His sons, though bonded by family ties, are as different as night and day. The elder son, steadfast and dutiful, has always stayed close to home, sharing in his father's labors and responsibilities. The younger son, brimming with restless ambition and a yearning for freedom, often gazes beyond the horizon, dreaming of a life unbound by the constraints of his upbringing. In this parable, Jesus weaves a story that resonates with every listener, then and now. To his original audience, Pharisees, sinners, and disciples, the message was one of deep spiritual significance. It challenged societal norms, offering a vision of a God who welcomes the wayward, celebrates their return, and extends grace beyond human comprehension. As we journey into this story, let's pause to reflect. How often do we feel the pull of freedom, the desire to chart our own course away from the guidance of those who love us. The younger son's choice may seem distant in time, but his longing is one we all know, a longing for independence, even at great cost. With this context in mind, let's enter the parable. Take a deep breath and allow yourself to immerse in the unfolding narrative. Each step forward brings us closer to understanding the Father's love, the Son's transformation, and the lessons that echo through eternity. After many months of contemplation, the younger son could no longer bear the weight of the life he had known. The comfort, the security, the predictable rhythms of farm life, they all began to feel like chains. Despite all the blessings that had been provided to him, he felt trapped, longing for a freedom he could not quite define. In the depths of his mind, a restless desire stirred, a yearning to break free from the family, the traditions, the responsibility that awaited him as part of his father's legacy. One morning, the son woke up earlier than usual. The golden sunlight poured through the open window, bathing the room in a soft, comforting glow. But it didn't touch his heart. His mind was far away, consumed with the thought of what he intended to do. It was time. He knew what he needed to ask, but the thought of approaching his father with such a request filled him with a certain dread. He had been raised to honor his family and his heritage. To ask for his inheritance before his father's passing was not just unusual, it was an act of severing his connection to the family's traditions. But in his heart, he felt certain this was what he must do. With a sense of determination, he dressed quickly, his steps deliberate. The house was still, with only the sound of birds in the distance. He approached his father's study, where the old man often sat, absorbed in the details of managing the estate. His father was a man who had built everything with hard work, integrity, and a sense of duty to his family. The younger son had always known that, but it wasn't enough to keep him rooted to the familiar. As he entered, the father looked up from his work, his face full of quiet expectation. He had always had a sense of what was happening in his sons' lives, though he often chose not to intervene. But today, something felt different. He could see the hesitation in the younger son's eyes, the way he nervously shifted from foot to foot, and his heart sank. "Father," the son began, his voice faltering slightly as he tried to mask the nervousness, "I've made a decision. I wish to leave. I would like you to give me my share of the inheritance." The words felt like a hammer striking the air between them. The father's expression shifted, and for a brief moment his world seemed to stop. The son had always been the more restless of the two, but this request, this was something far beyond his expectations. It wasn't just about money. It was a desire to completely cut ties, to abandon the legacy his father had built. The father's heart sank. He had worked so hard to build a life that his sons could inherit, and to hear that his younger son wanted to walk away from it all was more painful than words could express. Yet, deep down, the father understood. He had seen that same yearning in his own youth, the desire to seek something beyond what was known, to make one's own mark on the world. But what stung was the realization that his son had no desire to continue the journey of building a future together as a family. For several moments, there was silence. The father looked at his son, his mind racing through all the years of love, sacrifice, and guidance. He wanted to say something to stop him, but he knew this was a choice that the younger son had to make on his own. He couldn't hold him back. This was the son's journey now, I understand, the father finally said, his voice steady but filled with sadness. I'll give you your inheritance. You may go, but know that the door will always remain open for you. The son, eager and impatient, barely felt the weight of the father's words. He took the money, not out of gratitude, but out of a desire to escape. To him, the inheritance was simply a ticket to a new life, a life that didn't come with the burden of expectations or the shadow of his father's influence. He left without a second thought. The father watched as his son disappeared into the horizon, carrying with him all that had been given to him. He stood there at the doorway, the silence pressing in on him as the reality of the situation settled in. The relationship had shifted, and while the father could not fully understand his son's desire to leave, he knew the time had come for him to let go. With his inheritance in hand and a heart filled with youthful ambition, the younger son set off from the comfort of his father's estate. The world before him was vast, teeming with possibilities that he had never before considered. For years he had lived under the watchful gaze of his father, his every decision influenced by the rules of the household and the expectations placed upon him by his family and his community. But now that chapter of his life was behind him, and he could begin anew. His departure was not a quiet affair. Word spread quickly, and the village whispered about the son who had taken his fortune and chosen to seek a life away from the land that had raised him. The younger son, however, did not concern himself with such talk. His excitement, his newfound sense of freedom, drowned out any voices of caution. The road ahead stretched out before him, and the world felt like a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of his choices. He traveled far, leaving behind the familiar landscape of his childhood, the rolling hills, the bustling marketplace, the faces he had known since birth. They were now distant memories, replaced by strange new sights and sounds. He arrived in a distant land, a place where no one knew his name, where his past meant nothing, and his future was only limited by his own imagination. In this new world, he was no longer the son of a wealthy farmer. He was a man of means, a man of power, and the world lay at his feet. The first few weeks were filled with adventure. The bustling city streets, with their towering buildings and noisy marketplaces, beckoned him into a world of indulgence and excitement. There, he quickly found company, people who shared his love for pleasure, for enjoyment, for the thrill of life without consequence. The younger son, who had once known only the steady rhythms of farm life, was now surrounded by the intoxication of wealth and luxury, the finest clothes, the most expensive foods, and the richest drinks. These became his daily companions. In the eyes of those around him, he was a man of status, someone to be admired and envied, and so he indulged. The money his father had given him seemed endless at first, and he believed it would never run dry. He threw lavish parties, bought extravagant gifts, and entertained a crowd that cheered his every move. At night, he would wander the streets, intoxicated by the freedom that came with being far from home, far from the rules and expectations that had once defined his life. With each passing day, the younger son grew bolder. The pleasures that once seemed like indulgences now felt like rights. His rights. He reveled in the adoration of the people around him, basking in their praise and admiration. They were drawn to his wealth, his charisma, and his willingness to share his fortune with those who flattered him. He was the life of every gathering, the center of attention, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerful. But as the weeks turned into months, the glitter of his new life began to lose its luster. The money, which had seemed endless, began to dwindle. Each extravagant feast, each night spent in lavish excess, chipped away at his fortune. What had once seemed like a boundless source of freedom now felt like a weight, one that he could no longer sustain. The younger son found himself grappling with a sinking realization his wealth would not last forever, and he had nothing to fall back on. At first, he denied it. He continued to live as he had, throwing his wealth around and enjoying the adulation of his new friends. But soon, the reality became undeniable. His fortune was slipping through his fingers. The lavish parties grew fewer, the lavish gifts less frequent, and the people who had once surrounded him began to disappear. His so-called friends were nowhere to be found when the money dried up. The streets that had once seemed so full of life now felt empty and cold. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, a famine swept across the land. The markets that had once been filled with the rich smells of fresh bread and ripe fruits were now barren. The city that had been so full of life now stood still in the face of hunger. And in that moment, the younger son realized that he had not only spent his inheritance, but he had also spent his time chasing after things that could never truly satisfy him. With the famine, the younger son's position grew desperate. His friends, who had once been so eager to indulge in his wealth, turned their backs on him when they could offer him nothing in return. And as his fortune dwindled to nothing, he was left to face the harsh reality of his choices. He had squandered his inheritance, and now he found himself with no money, no friends, and no future. He had reached a point of utter despair. The once great dreams of adventure and excitement that had led him to leave his home had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of his decisions. The world that had once seemed full of promise now seemed indifferent, even hostile. And in the depths of his despair, the younger son was forced to confront the truth. He had nowhere to turn but back to the place he had once left behind. As the days passed in the distant land, the younger son's initial excitement began to fade. The wealth and indulgence that had once seemed so appealing slowly lost their luster. In the beginning, his newfound freedom felt like a fresh start. No rules, no expectations, just endless opportunities. But as time wore on, the reality of his choices became painfully clear. He had spent his inheritance recklessly, indulging in luxuries without a thought for tomorrow. Friends had surrounded him as long as there was money to spend, but as the funds dwindled, so did the number of his companions. One by one, those who had once cheered him on, shared in his lavish banquets, and celebrated his every whim, disappeared as quickly as they had come. The young man, now alone and destitute, found himself with nothing. His clothes, once fine and well-tailored, were now ragged and dirty. His stomach, which had once been filled with the finest foods and wine, now groaned in hunger. The streets that had once felt exciting and full of possibility now felt cold and isolating. It was in the midst of this desolation that a famine, a great famine, struck the land. With his inheritance spent and no friends to turn to, the younger son found himself in desperate need. He began searching for work, but opportunities were scarce. At last, he found a job feeding pigs. The work was humiliating, as it required him to tend to the very animals that were considered unclean by his culture. The young man, once so proud and full of ambition, now found himself in the most degrading position he could imagine. As the days dragged on, his suffering grew. He had nothing to eat but the scraps that were meant for the pigs, and even those were often scarce. The hunger he felt was not just physical, it was deep within his soul. He had wandered far from home, far from the love and care of his father. It was in this state of utter despair that he began to reflect on his actions. In his heart, a slow realization began to dawn. He had squandered everything: his inheritance, his relationships, his dignity. He had turned his back on everything that had once given him stability and hope. But it wasn't just the material loss that gnawed at him. He realized, too, the emotional toll of his choices. He had pushed away his family, his father's love, all for the fleeting thrill of freedom. Now, sitting in the muck and filth, his heart began to break. He could no longer deny the depth of his mistakes. The son's suffering was no longer just external. It was an emotional and spiritual crisis. Yet, it was in the darkest moments of his despair that he had the spark of realization. It was not too late to return home. The young man's mind raced as he thought about his father, how he had treated him, how he had disrespected him. But he also remembered the kindness and compassion his father had always shown. And in that moment, a plan began to form. He would return home, not as a son, but as a servant. He didn't believe he deserved to be welcomed back into the family, but he knew that his father's servants were treated better than he was now. Perhaps, he thought, if he could just return and beg for forgiveness, his father might let him work as one of the hired hands. So, with a heart heavy with regret and a mind set on returning to the father he had abandoned, the son began his long journey back. He knew that he could never undo the damage he had done, but he hoped for mercy, a second chance, even as a servant. As the younger son began his journey back to his father, the path seemed longer than it ever had before. Every step he took was laden with the weight of regret, but it was also filled with the faintest glimmer of hope. He had no expectations of being welcomed back as a son, but in the depths of his heart he longed for even the slightest bit of mercy. The dusty road stretched out before him, and as he neared his father's estate, the memories of his home began to flood back. The sights, the sounds, the warmth of the hearth, it all seemed so distant now, like a world he could never return to. But his determination remained, and with each step he grew more resolved to face the consequences of his actions, even if it meant being rejected by the one person he had once loved most. And then, just as he was nearing the gates of his father's house, something incredible happened. From a distance, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the property, looking out into the horizon. It was his father. He stood there, watching for something, waiting for something, perhaps for someone. When the father saw his son, something profound stirred within him. He did not wait for his son to reach him, but rather he ran. He ran toward him with all the speed his old legs could muster. The father did not hesitate, did not look at his son with anger or disappointment. He ran to him with open arms, with love in his heart, and with forgiveness already prepared. The younger son, overwhelmed by this unexpected sight, could not comprehend what was happening. He had been prepared to grovel, to beg for a chance to work as a servant, But before he could even speak, his father had already embraced him. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you," the son began, his voice thick with emotion. "I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please take me in as one of your hired servants." But the father, his heart overflowing with compassion, would not allow his son to continue. He interrupted him with a loud, joyous command. "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Kill the fattened calf. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The son, though humbled and ashamed, found himself swept up in his father's unconditional love and acceptance. It was as if all the wrongs he had done, all the mistakes he had made, were washed away in the flood of his father's grace. The father's love for his son was not dependent on his behavior, but on a bond that could never be broken. It was a love that transcended failure and triumph, a love that sought only to restore and heal. As the father ordered the celebration to begin, the younger son stood in awe, his heart overflowing with gratitude. He had expected nothing, no mercy, no forgiveness. But what he had received was more than he could have ever dreamed. His father's love was not conditional on his worthiness. It was simply given freely and unconditionally. And so, the prodigal son was home again, not as a servant, not as a beggar, but as a beloved child, restored and forgiven. As we pause to reflect on the story of the prodigal son, there is so much to take in, and the lessons are rich with meaning. The story is one of love, grace, forgiveness, and the incredible power of redemption. But beyond the surface, there are layers of deeper truths that speak to our hearts, reminding us of the divine love that God offers to each of us, no matter how far we may stray. The younger son's journey away from home represents all of us at times, when we feel lost, disconnected, or in pursuit of things that ultimately fail to bring us true peace or fulfillment. We can all relate to moments of rebellion, when we make decisions we later regret, or choose paths that lead us into hardship. Like the prodigal son, we may find ourselves empty and broken, realizing that what we thought we wanted never satisfied the longing in our souls. But the beautiful part of this story is that the Father's love never wavers. Despite the son's mistakes, despite the wrong choices, the Father's heart remains open, ready to forgive and restore. This is not just a story about a father and his son, it's a reflection of how God views us, his children. No matter how far we wander, God is always waiting with open arms, eager to welcome us back, to restore us to our rightful place in his family. The son's repentance, though genuine and heartfelt, is not the reason for his restoration. His father's love is the reason. The father doesn't wait for the son to prove himself or to earn back his status. He simply runs to him, embraces him, and welcomes him home. This is a picture of grace, undeserved, unearned, and unconditional. When the son is embraced, it is not only a moment of forgiveness, but also a moment of healing. His past mistakes no longer define him. He is no longer the son who squandered his inheritance or rebelled against his father. He is the beloved son who has been found, who has been forgiven, and who has been made whole again. The Father's love is not just about wiping away the wrongs, but about restoring the son to his full identity. As we reflect on this powerful story, we are reminded of the love that God has for each of us. No matter what we have done, No matter how far we have strayed, God is waiting for us to return, not with condemnation, but with open arms, ready to welcome us home. His grace is sufficient for us, and His love never fails. And as we ponder the joy of the Father's embrace, we are invited to consider how we can live in that same love and grace toward others. Just as the Father forgave His Son freely, we too are called to forgive those who have wronged us. Just as the Father showed mercy without condition, we too are called to extend mercy to others, not because they deserve it, but because it reflects the love that God has shown us. In the end, the story of the prodigal son is not just about one son's return, but about the incredible truth that God's love is always available to us. His forgiveness is there, waiting for us to accept it. No matter how far we wander, we can always return to the loving embrace of our Heavenly Father. As we bring this journey to a close, we reflect on the profound lessons from the parable of the prodigal son. It is a story that speaks to each of us, reminding us that no matter how far we stray, there is always a path back home. God's love for us is unwavering, and His forgiveness is available to all who seek it. The Father's embrace of His Son is a powerful reminder of the grace that is freely given to us, even when we feel undeserving. Just as the Son returned to His Father with a heart full of repentance, we too are invited to return to God, to seek His forgiveness, and to experience the fullness of His love. And as we receive this grace, we are reminded of our call to extend that same love and mercy to others. The story is not just about our return to God, but about the way we live out His love in the world, offering forgiveness, compassion, and grace to those around us. The prodigal son story is a story of redemption, of healing, and of the unchanging love of a Father who never gives up on His children. And as we reflect on this truth, we are reminded that no matter where we are in life, God is always with us, always waiting with open arms, ready to welcome us home. So, as you drift off into peaceful sleep tonight, may this story remind you of the immense love God has for you. May you find comfort in knowing that no matter what you've done, no matter where you've been, you are always welcome in His arms. And as you rest, may your heart be filled with the peace that comes from knowing that you are loved beyond measure. Thank you for joining me tonight for this time of reflection. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stick around for the next peaceful story to help you relax and reflect. And if you have a favorite Bible story or parable that you'd love to hear, drop it in the comments below. I'd love to share it with you. Until next time, sleep peacefully, knowing you are deeply loved and forever cherished.